When we think about South African rugby greats, I'm willing to bet that few, if any, aside from a couple of fanatics and history nerds, will be able to recall the OGs of Springbok rugby, men like Herbert Castens. By the late 1880s, the game of rugby was sweeping through South Africa. Even though South Africa did not yet exist as a political entity, the newly formed South African Rugby Board figured that the country was ready to face a touring team from the mother country and sent out feelers to the Rugby Football Union based in Twickenham, England. But a week before the Brits were due to arrive, the organisers suddenly realised that they hadn't selected a South African team yet. So plans were quickly made to host trials where players were invited to come and show off their skills in the hope of being picked for the national team. But many of the invited players failed to turn up, apparently due to a combination of crappy weather being forecast for the day of the trials, as well as the arrival of the mail. But one man who decided to brave the elements was a 26-year-old lawyer called Herbert Hayton Castens. Herbie was born in the rural backroads of Kirsten, between Graafrenet and Somerset East, on the 23rd of November 1864, but grew up to be very much the British gentleman. He was educated in England, quite appropriately at rugby school, the institution from where it was thought the sport first originated. Herbs then attempted Oxford University, where he studied law, and while there he excelled in rugby and cricket, beating Oxford's inter-varsity rivals Cambridge in both sporting codes. He eventually returned to South Africa, settling in Cape Town to practice law, and joined Villages Rugby Football Club. He played prop, but in those days even props were required to kick the ball, and Herbie had the ability to kick the ball far downfield so that his fellow forwards could charge and try to regather it. While playing for Villages, he was asked to attend the national trials. After impressing selectors at the first trials, Herbs was asked to return for a second trials game, but that did not go so well. After kicking one of his characteristic dribbles downfield, Herbie charged towards the ball along with the rest of his team, but somehow he collided with one of his teammates and tumbled head over heels. This caused the spectators to burst out in collective laughter. However, this didn't deter him, and he got up and played on. Eventually, he was selected to be part of the first ever South African rugby team. But for Herbie, the honour of being selected was not quite as great as his excitement of getting to see two of his old Oxford pals who had been picked for the British team. The Brits docked in Cape Town amidst great fanfare and brass bands, and Herbie was one of the first to meet his mates. But the tourists had a daunting schedule of 20 matches, which included the 3 tests against South Africa. The first match of the tour was scheduled against the Cape Town club's 15 side. To his great surprise, old Herbie was asked to referee that game. Apparently, the officials reckoned that he knew many of the players on both sides very well, and so it would be difficult for him to favour one side over the other. Despite the worries of having a home side ref, the Brits were victorious, beating the local side 15-1. Castens was quite happy to award what would turn out to be the only point scored against the touring side during their time in South Africa. 2 days later, Castens took to the field once more, this time as a player for Western Province. The tourists beat Province 6-0, but Herbie's performance made people think of his name as a possible captain for the first test. To his delight, he was chosen to captain the first ever South African rugby team. Finally, the day of the first test in Port Elizabeth, or Gqeberha, dawned. By all accounts, it was quite a windy day, living up to the city's reputation. But despite the weather, 8,000 people came to St. George's Park to witness history in the making. However, South Africa's introduction to the international test arena was somewhat rocky. By halftime, the home side trailed 4-0. But Herbie's leadership skills shined through, and as he passed the Nazis to the rest of his team, he apparently gave a rousing speech to instill their confidence. Needless to say, the South Africans still lost the first test, but at least they kept the English scoreless in the second half, and this made the scoreboard look quite respectable. Everyone had kind of expected defeat, and if there were post-match interviews during that time, Castens would most probably have said he and his team will go back to the drawing board but there were definitely a lot of positives. But unfortunately, Herbie did not get the chance to captain his side again. The second test was to be played in Kimberley, and so the selectors of the Griqualand West Rugby Union were more eager to see one of their own as captain than an outsider. So they dropped him from the side altogether. In fact, as it turned out, that first test would be Herbert Castens' first and only game for South Africa. But as fate would have it, SA Rugby was not done with him. Not yet. Bizarrely, the organisers sent an invitation to old Herbie, asking him if he would be so kind as to blow the whistle for the final test of this historic tour. Herbie obliged, and in doing so, he made his own little bit of history by becoming the only rugby player to play and referee in matches in the same rugby test series. Fuck